All right, hello everyone. This is chapter 2 for introductory psychology, the biology of mind and consciousness. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking a great deal about the structures and the function of the brain. We'll be discussing nerve cells and neurotransmitters and hormones and eventually move into attention, consciousness, and sleep and dreams. First, I wanted to start by asking you, have you ever heard this claim that we only use 10% of our brain? This is something that became very popular in kind of pop psychology and even the media, with a lot of films addressing the fact that if you could access the extra 90% of your brain, you'd perhaps be able to have superpowers, levitate, or control things with your mind, which is kind of a fun idea. However, this idea, this myth, has actually been around since the late 1800s. Technology has changed a lot since then, and we assume that the myth started because at the time we only understood what 10% of the brain actually controlled. Since we didn't understand the other parts, we assumed that we weren't able to access them. However, if you look at anyone who's had maybe a traumatic brain injury, you'll see that any damage to any parts of the brain are going to inhibit an individual in their everyday lives. If we only really use 10% of our brain, we could injure the other 90% and nothing would happen. So you can see that in stroke victims or maybe even any zombie films that the best way to injure an individual is to take out the brain. And nearly every region of the brain, when an individual goes into an fMRI, it lights up during even simple tasks. So the brain is constantly communicating at all times. Even when you're asleep, you're still using your brain to solve certain tasks, such as memories and the development of dreams. The brain also requires and burns about 20% of our energy. And if it was really only working at 10% capacity, this would be a lot of energy that would be wasted. So there's a lot of things to support the idea that this 10% myth is actually not real. We tend to use our entire brains throughout all activities, and we'll be discussing all those different structures and how they interact with each other. So in this section, we'll be discussing psychology and biology, how the two are related. We'll also be discussing nerve cells and synapses, the communication between nerve cells. We'll be talking about neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers that communicate complex ideas. We'll be discussing the nervous system and how that interacts with the entire body. We'll also be discussing the endocrine system. The endocrine system's important for the release of hormones throughout the bloodstream. We'll be discussing different structures of the brain, and then later on we'll be talking about attention, consciousness, and then finish up by discussing sleep and dreams. So to begin, I wanted to preface with this sentence right here. Everything psychological is biological. And I want you to think about that for a second. What does that mean? That everything that you think, that you feel, that you interact, all your behaviors are biological by nature. Really, when it comes down to it, everything that you feel, everything that you think, everything you say and do is driven by two things: electrical impulses and chemical messengers. So if you really want to break down who you are as an individual, well, you can look at the building blocks. So everything psychological is biological. Our moods, feelings, and sensations are really all spurred on by our biological condition. And today we start looking into how the chemistry of the body influences how you think and how you feel. This Pixar movie, Inside Out, does a really great job of illustrating the way we process and retrieve memories. And it did a really phenomenal job at personifying emotions. They brought on a lot of psychologists, biological neuroscientists, to help them understand how to personify a lot of these brain structures. So this is your brain. Your brain encompasses many different nerve cells called neurons, and these neurons spread out throughout your brain. They number in the billions, and they communicate through a neural net. So they kind of look like a spider web, and the reason for that is because they connect with all different types of neurons in kind of like a transit system or a highway, a superhighway of information. They send these electrical impulses and these chemical messengers between them so they can get to their final destination. Their main purpose is to communicate messages, to understand what messages mean, and to learn from them. So neurons are growing and adapting according to what you do in your everyday life. This right here is a picture of a common neuron. This is something that you usually see in textbooks to help you identify the different structures of a neuron. It really all starts with the soma. So most cells have a cell body, and the cell body is kind of like the heart of the cell. It has a lot of the the structures that keep it running. So the mitochondria, the ribosomes. It has a nucleus right here. The nucleus houses a lot of these important structures, including the DNA. DNA is going to be very central for manufacturing a lot of proteins that help the cell grow and develop a lot of the important messengers that are required to send these messages down the cell. So if any part of the neuron is damaged, it might be able to still survive. It might be able to actually replenish and regrow. However, if the soma dies or is damaged, then the rest of the cell will die as well. So it's a very important key feature of making sure that the cell continues to thrive. Next, we have the dendrites. So the dendrites are kind of like a receiver on a cell phone. They receive messages from all different cells around it, and they are constantly spreading out, similar to roots in a tree, looking for those nutrients, looking for those messages from other cells. Dendrite is actually Greek for roots, and it works very similar, spreading out and connecting to other neurons. The point of dendrites is to listen and to pick up electrical signals and chemical messengers from other neighboring neurons. So we've got another cell over here. It has its dendrites as well. And the process on which it receives information is messages are first transferred over to the dendrites themselves. They pick up those messages and they transfer them over to the cell body or the soma. When they get here, they try to interpret what kind of message it is. Typically, these messages are going to be very simplistic. They're going to be kind of like Morse code. They're just taps. But the thing that differs between these messages is usually not necessarily how fast it goes, but how often a message occurs. So it's really going to be two different messages. It might be the difference between the wind blowing against the hairs on your arm or a spider crawling on your arm. Both of those are going to elicit a very similar message. However, the importance of that message is going to really be determined by how often those signals are being sent. And extremely important messages that you have to pay attention to right now, like a bug crawling on your arm, are going to be picked up a lot faster. They're going to be prioritized. The soma and the cell body helps prioritize these messages by determining how important that message is. If it determines that the message is very important, it will send it down the axon. If the dendrites are like the roots of a tree, then the axon would be the trunk. The axon's job is to communicate the messages that come in down the axon so that it's able to jump from one neuron to the next. One of the ways that helps the axon do this, aside from just its one long superhighway, is that it has these fatty tissue deposits that are kind of clumped together along the axon. This is called the myelin sheath. These are the fatty deposits that are insulating the axon. I like to think of it kind of like a cable. So if you look at the cable that's charging your phone, usually if it's broken, you can look inside and you'll see that there is metal inside it. Sometimes it's copper, sometimes it's going to be any different types of metal. Usually it's metal because that's a very strong conductor for electricity. So it will take that electricity and it will move it in the direction it needs to go very quickly. However, surrounding the metal is rubber. And rubber surrounds it because it insulates the metal. It makes sure that the message is being sent to where it needs to go. And it also makes sure that the electricity doesn't escape. And that's really what myelin does. It helps insulate the axon so that the message is sent where it needs to go, in the direction it needs to go. And it also helps it so the message doesn't escape outside. It insulates it very similar to the rubber surrounding a cable. Another thing that it does is it speeds up how fast a message can go. And so if you have myelin surrounding certain axons, it will speed up that message and make it move faster so that it can jump to the next neuron a lot faster. Certain disorders, such as multiple sclerosis, is a muscular disorder in which an individual loses the ability to control certain muscle groups. And that's usually what happens when the myelin sheath degrades. When it degrades and maybe some of these fatty tissues start disintegrating, then messages aren't going to be sent down the axon. They're not going to be able to make it down there, and then they might lose and be sent off into a void. So they're not able to be sent towards the muscle group that they need to, so you're not able to control certain muscles. So myelin's very important for speed and also very important to get the message to where it needs to go. Once a message makes it down the axon, it gets towards the final area. If we're looking at this as a tree, then this would be the branches. The branches are the axon terminals. And the terminals are important because they're the final area of this neuron before the message gets sent towards the neighboring neuron. They also house these individual chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But their job is to send those neurotransmitters to the next cell so that the cell can interpret what kind of information or what kind of transmitter it's being received. So, axon terminals speak and dendrites listen. That's a very important distinction right there, is that you've got listening, then you got interpreting, you have sending a message, and then you have speaking. Sending another message towards a neighboring neuron. So how does information travel down the axon? We know that the dendrites themselves receive information, and the soma interprets that information, but how does it get sent down? How does it know if the information that's being received is important, that it needs to send it down? Well, it's all determined by the charge that's inside of a neuron. And when I mean charge, I mean an electrical charge. So think of your axons kind of like batteries. If you have a battery and you hold it in your hand, is it producing electricity? No. Something needs to happen to that battery in order to produce that electricity, right? It has the potential to produce electricity because it has charges inside of it, but it's not actually going to be sending that message. It's not going to be sending that electricity until something happens. Usually you have to connect the positive and the negative sides of that battery, so plug it into like a remote control in order for it to actually stimulate both of those sides and make them traverse towards each other. By sending that energy towards each other, they start producing electricity. And that's this very similar with the axon. It has the potential to produce electricity inside it, but it needs something. It needs a switch in order for it to be able to start producing that electricity, to send that electricity down the axon. So what is that switch? it's usually a different charge inside of the neuron. So the neuron itself has a negative charge. It sits at a negative level. Um, so it's usually around negative 70 millivolts. You don't have to remember that, so don't worry. But just for reference sakes, it's negative 70 millivolts inside of the neuron. That's its resting potential. That's the battery when nothing's happening to it. However, something might happen where you might get messages coming in to let you know, hey, something's crawling on my arm, and that might change the charge of the inside of the neuron. That might make it a little more positive. When it becomes more positive, it hits what's called a threshold. So think of it kind of like a dam of water. And the dam has a certain level until if it hits this top mark, it will open up the floodgates and release all that water, all that potential. So what your neuron does, when you get a message that comes in that tells you something's important, it becomes more positive inside. It reaches that threshold. And once it reaches that threshold of all that positive energy, it hits what's called a all or nothing response. That means that it will send that message down because the opening of the floodgates can't be stopped at that point. It sends the message down through the axon all the way to the end, the axon terminals. That message that gets sent down all the way through it is called action potential. That action potential is the electrical impulse that gets sent down the axon. Another way of looking at it is kind of like thinking about your toilet. So when you flush your toilet, you have to push the lever in order to do it, right? But if you push the lever just a little bit, if you tap the lever, it's not going to send the water, right? You have to hit a certain threshold. In the lever situation for your toilet, it's pressure. So you have to hit a certain amount of pressure before you release it. And that all or nothing response means that it's going to be sending it down after that point. Another distinction is that it's not going to, if you hit that lever with all your force as fast as you can, it's still going to send that message down at the same speed every time. So think about if you like slam down on the lever for your toilet. It's not going to make the water move faster, right? It's going to move at the same speed every single time. And that's what happens with these messages. The only thing that determines whether a message is important is how often that message gets sent down. And so that's something neurons typically look for. Okay, so we've got the dendrites that are over here. They received a message, the soma cell body interprets it, it sends it down the axon to the axon terminals, and now we're right here at this period, where we have a neighboring cell right here, and we have axon terminals right here. The message has received the axon terminals, it's gotten to the axon terminals right here, and right now this area, this relationship, this interconnectivity right here, is blown up right here. So it's magnified so you can see what one axon terminal and one dendrite looks like magnified. This right here, this connection right here is called the synapse. The synapse is the junction between the axon tip right here of the sending neuron and the dendrite of the receiving neuron. So the synapse is important because it's where the communication between one neuron and the next happens. Now, you may look at it and you may see pictures of neurons and try and say, you may look at it and think that these are touching each other, that it's kind of like a cable that's interconnected. But actually, there is a very fine gap between the axon and the dendrite. And this fine gap right here is called the synaptic gap. So what happens is, remember, action potential is that electrical energy that's sent down the axon, that, determined by a change of the charge inside the neuron, a message being sent down the axon. When action potential reaches the axon terminals, it interconnects with these modules that are located inside it, filled with chemical messengers. These chemical messengers, these bubbles, are called neurotransmitters, and they house thousands of neurotransmitters in each one of these. So the action potential that comes down forces the neurotransmitters to go ahead and be sent out and meld with the membrane or the skin of the axon terminal, and then release all of those neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. They kind of shoot it out like a shotgun, and all of these are little BB pellets coming out of the shotgun. When it gets shot out into the synaptic gap, it then interacts with receptor sites. These receptor sites are kind of like locks that are located on the dendrites, and these locks are looking for their particular keys, the neurotransmitters being those keys. So neurotransmitters interact with their specific locks, and that's what determines what type of message gets sent. They don't interact with locks that they can't combine with, only the ones that they're specifically designed for. So when they get sent out, they interact with those receptor sites, then they transmit that information to the receiving neuron. The final process here is what happens afterwards. So you have the synaptic gap right here, you've got all these neurotransmitters that are sent over, they've released their message, and now they're floating around inside of this gap. Well, your neurons are really big into recycling. They want to reuse this information. So the next thing that happens is called reuptake. They are reabsorbing these neurotransmitters and packaging them into these little granules again. So this reuptake is recycling the neurotransmitters and making sure that they can repurpose them and reuse them again. And that right there is the process by which one neuron communicates with another neuron. Now this process is happening billions of times every millisecond. And if you can think about how many neurons you have, which I believe is around 36 billion in your brain, all communicating with each other, all these different individual dendrites communicating with different neurons, and all these axon terminals reaching out and branching to different neurons. There's just such a large neural net of information. That's why your reflexes and that's why your thinking can occur so quickly. Now, let's talk a little bit about neurotransmitters. Those are the chemical messengers at the axon terminals. They cause motion and emotion. They're very important for making us who we are. And by influencing how we feel, they are constantly influencing how we think. So everything that is psychological is also biological. They are driven and constantly motivating how we feel, how we think, how we move. So I was talking about these charges right here. A negative charge that's inside of the neuron, a negative 70 millivolts, and it needs to hit a certain threshold. Remember, it needs to become more positive in order for action potential to be fired through. That threshold is negative 55 millivolts. So it has to increase up to negative 55 from negative 70. In order to do that, it has to change the charge inside of the neuron. And what changes that charge is what type of neurotransmitter that interacts with it. So, a positive charge is going to be associated with an excitatory neurotransmitter. Excitatory means it's going to excite the neuron and it's going to increase the charge inside of it. Norepinephrine is a type of excitatory neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine is similar to adrenaline, in which you are becoming more alert and aroused to what's happening around you. You also have inhibitory neurotransmitters. These are negative in nature. They tell your body to slow down. They tell your body not to move as fast, to calm down. So inhibitory neurotransmitter, like serotonin, increases hunger, makes you more sleepy. So that might be very important in certain circumstances. To make things a little more complicated, you also have neurotransmitters that can both excite and inhibit based upon the context of the situation. So dopamine is a both excitatory and an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it's usually determined by what's happening in your context, what's happening in your life at that moment. Dopamine is important for learning, movement, and happy emotions. And it's also very important for identifying something that you're very excited for, like something that is like, let's say if you have a chocolate bar and you just love chocolate so much, dopamine's going to be firing to make you happy, but also make you remember that chocolate equals happiness. So a lot of addicts that take substances have an increased supply of dopamine at the beginning of their addiction. To recap, the first process right here, information from other cells and neurons is collected by the dendrites. The second process right here, information gets interpreted by the cell body. The third process right here, electrical impulses travel down the axon thanks to action potential. They're also assisted by these bubbles of fatty tissue called the myelin sheath. Fourth, right here, the end of the axon terminals, we have action potential, which stimulates the release of neurotransmitters. The release of neurotransmitters jumps the gap in the synaptic cleft. They embed themselves in the receptor sites of the next neuron, and they transmit that information. And the final process, number 5, is that neurotransmitters are then reabsorbed in a process called reuptake. Understanding these different structures, understanding the process of information as it moves through the neuron to the next neuron is very important. I encourage you to really understand this, and if you have any questions, reach out to me. I'd be glad to help reiterate some of this. Okay, so we've been talking about individual nerve cells, individual neurons. However, you have billions of those neurons, and they span your entire body, not only in your brain. So let's talk a little bit about the nervous system. The nervous system is broken into 2 main categories. And neuroscience is really the study of this nervous system. We have the central nervous system, the CNS, and central nervous system is really like the command center. It's important for understanding, important for making plans, and important for sending out orders. Identifying what is the most important, what is the priority, and sending that information out, commanding other units to work. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. The peripheral nervous system is kind of like the scouts. They're the ones that are in charge of relaying information from the body and then carrying out orders. They take orders from the central nervous system and they collect intelligence to bring it to the central nervous system. So the central nervous system making these decisions is located in the brain and the brain stem. That's where most of the decision making occurs. Sending out information, sending out orders, and collecting information, the peripheral nervous system will be located in the rest of the body. All the nerve cells that are interconnected with skeletal muscles and organs is going to be the peripheral nervous system. Did you know that the nervous system of a vole is 100 times smaller than the nervous system of an elephant? And it's one of the reasons that larger animals move a lot slower than smaller animals. The messages that are sent take a little bit longer to be received by different body parts. And so when you see large animals moving a little slower, it's generally because of this. Some people have theorized that dinosaurs actually had singular nerve cells that ran over 150 feet long. And while the transmission of information between that nerve cell would still be very fast, it would take a little bit longer than other creatures who are smaller. Okay, so we've been talking about the nervous system and discussing the process by which the nervous system communicates. So we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now, you can break down the peripheral nervous system into a smaller amount of categories. You have the autonomic nervous system right here. The autonomic nervous system is very important for a lot of automatic things. So, internal regulation, internal organs, and glands. Things that you typically don't have to think about. So, when they run on autopilot, the autonomic nervous system usually controls them. The next nervous system is the somatic nervous system. And if autonomic controls a lot of these autopilot things, then the somatic controls a lot of the things you have to think about, such as your skeletal muscles. If you want to move your hand and flip through pages in a book, that is going to be your somatic nervous system. Now, peripheral breaks into autonomic and somatic, and autonomic also breaks into two more categories. You have your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system, remember, autonomic isn't necessarily something you control, so it acts upon itself, but it usually kicks into gear when you're afraid. This is called the fight or flight response. Let's say you're on a trail, you turn around a corner and you see a wild animal, and it starts to rear up and it starts to become aggressive. You're going to immediately act on your instincts, which typically might be stand your ground and fight, freeze, or run away. That's your sympathetic nervous system kicking into gear. It releases adrenaline into your muscles and shuts down other systems that you don't need in order to divert the energy into your muscles so you can move faster. Now, let's say you run away, you make it all the way to your car, and you're safe. You've locked yourself in. At that point, you need to calm down. You can't always be in this state because it's detrimental to your health to constantly be hyper aroused. So parasympathetic nervous system is when you chill out and you have a calming reaction. You return to your normal baseline. You return to a point in which you're able to calm yourself. Okay, so here we have our first activity. This is going to be which nervous system controls what. And what I want you to do, and you're not going to be breaking into groups for this, but I want you to do this on a document. I want you to try and match the examples of the nervous system with which ones match best. So sometimes, a lot of these are going to be relating towards peripheral or central nervous system. However, if you can break it down even further, I want you to break it down to the closest category that best relates towards what we're talking about here. So go ahead and name or number your page 1 through 7 and go all the way down towards understanding the best nervous system that applies towards this specific example. So hold on a second. Let me go back. So that'll be activity number 1. Okay. Let's keep moving. Okay. Now, when we were talking about neurons, we were discussing the fact that they communicate with other neighboring neurons. So there are 3 different types of neurons that communicate throughout the body. The first are called your sensory neurons. The sensory neuron's job is to communicate from the tissue to the brain and spinal cord, to the central nervous system. So sensory neurons are specifically designed for picking up of certain senses. You have sensory neurons in your ears that pick up sound waves. You have sensory neurons on your skin that pick up tactile information or touch. You have sensory neurons in your nose that pick up olfactory scents. And you have sensory neurons in your eyes that pick up light waves. Sensory neurons in your mouth that pick up taste buds and different taste sensations. And so all of these are going to be sensory neurons that pick up on all of your senses and send that over to the brain and spinal cord. Now, when you feel something crawling on your arm, The sensory neuron is going to send that information to the central nervous system. Then the central nervous system decides, okay, you need to pay attention to your arm and start swiping. It is going to send information to your muscles through the use of motor neurons. Motor neurons carry these orders to your muscles, to your skeletal muscles, so that you can move. Picking up your hand and brushing it against your arm is a movement that is required by your muscles. So the motor neurons are going to control those actions. The final type is called an interneuron. And the interneuron's job is to connect sensory neurons to motor neurons. So its job is to act kind of like a relay station. It is situated in different parts of the brain and different parts of the spinal cord so that it can connect both these neurons to each other and communicate those messages back and forth. So sensory, motor, interneuron. Now, I want you to imagine that you're a very young child at this point, like maybe around 5 years old. And you're wandering in the kitchen and you look up and you see this. So what do you do when you're in the kitchen? What do you do when you see this? You touch it, right? It's glowing, it has heat, it's a pretty color. Of course you're going to touch it, right? And what's going to happen when you touch it? You're going to start crying. It's going to be painful, right? You're going to start bawling. Except me. That never happened for me because I'm too cool for that. But this idea of touching it and then crying has something that happens before you start crying. And you may have noticed this a couple times if you've ever gotten injured and you didn't realize that you were in pain until afterwards. But typically, when you touch something that's burning or something that's very hot, you're going to instinctually, reflexively pull away from it. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor and they use the little mallet to tap onto your kneecap and you just do that reflex, that kick out. Without even knowing it, without even thinking about it, you reflexively pull back. This is called a reflex arc. And it's often referred to as a no-brainer reflex arc because you react without even thinking about it. And then after you react, then the pain starts to come in. But first, your muscles, your motor neurons, your sensory neurons, are going to receive the heat information from that fire, and they're going to send it over towards your spinal cord. Now, your spinal cord already has embedded in it certain messages and certain reflexes. It doesn't have to think about it. It already has that information preloaded. And so sending over from the sensory neuron, it lets your spinal cord know that there's heat, that there's danger, and it immediately, without sending that a message to the brain, it immediately connects it to a motor neuron. The motor neuron comes out and you have an outgoing information to tell you to reflexively pull back. Then a second wave of information travels up the sensory neuron, and that gets sent to the brain, and that interprets it being painful. But it's pretty interesting that your body already has these defense mechanisms built into it to reflexively pull away whenever danger comes. Okay, so that was the central nervous system, or the nervous system as a whole. Now we're going to be talking about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is a set of glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. And you have many different glands throughout your body that control a lot of basic attributes, such as attraction, appetite, and aggression. The thing about the endocrine system and about hormones is that it is way slower than the nervous system as it secretes the hormones through glands in the bloodstream and then reabsorbs it into tissue, like the brain. If the nervous system wants to get a hold of you, if the nervous system wants to say something, it will send very fast messages through electrical impulses and very fast chemical messengers. And it's kind of like a text message. It sends that message extremely quickly, and it's very fleeting because you look at it once, you get the information, and then you disregard it. However, hormones are very similar towards like writing a letter. You write a letter, you put it in an envelope, you stick a stamp on it, you send it out to someone. It's a lot longer to receive that message because it has to travel through so many different areas. However, it lingers when it gets to its desired location. It stays with you. And so it's kind of like when you receive a letter, you're very excited about it. You hold on to it. You may put it onto the fridge. Those messages are going to stay a lot longer and they're going to linger in your system. It's one of the reasons that if you are very upset at someone and then you realize that maybe you're wrong, maybe you shouldn't be upset, you can't help still feeling angry at them, even though you logically know that you're in the wrong. You still have that lingering anger, and it's because those hormones are still in your bloodstream. They haven't disappeared yet. Everything psychological is first biological. Now, the endocrine system has a lot of different glands, but it's controlled by one master gland. This is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is located in the hypothalamus, which we'll talk a little bit later on about what that controls, but for the most part, the hypothalamus regulates the body. It determines when you're hungry, when you're sleepy, it determines your temperature of your body, and it decides what to do. It decides what hormones to wake up to make sure other glands start releasing them. It also releases growth hormones. So when you're young, it will release the growth hormones into your bloodstream to make you grow much larger. You have the thyroid gland right here in your neck, and this thyroid gland is going to be important for metabolism, breaking down food, making sure to distribute that nutrition throughout your body. Your adrenal glands right here release adrenaline. If you are in that fight or flight response and you need to act quickly, the adrenaline will kick into gear and release it towards the skeletal muscles so that you can burn up those reserves and move faster. Your pancreas is important for insulin and sugar levels, deciding what sugar levels you require in order to metabolize certain nutrition and in order to make sure that your body stays at an equilibrium or a balanced state. And then you have your sex hormones, testes for men and ovaries for women. And so these will release the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. And they're very important for developing the biological sex of an individual and also for developing certain desires later on. Okay, we're going to watch a video. It can be a little loud, so make sure if you're listening with headphones, make sure you don't have those headphones on for this. I just don't want it to be too loud for you. So go ahead and watch this video. Okay, so hopefully it had the desired effect of scaring you. What was the point of this besides me just messing around with you? Oh, let's not watch it again. Now, when you're startled, when you're afraid, a couple things happen in your body. They interact with different structures, and they all communicate with each other in a certain chain. Your pituitary gland, remember that's in your hormones, that's your master gland, will wake up your adrenal glands. It tells your adrenal glands to send blood into your bloodstream, and then when that blood with adrenaline reaches your brain, it processes it with the context of what's happening. And it lets you know that I was just messing with you, that it's not actually, you're not in danger, and so your brain will communicate with your adrenal gland to shut down the adrenaline that courses through your blood. This is called the feedback loop. It's when your nervous system directs your endocrine system, which in turn directs your nervous system. So brain, gland, hormone, and brain. And following in that particular order, it will communicate throughout your entire body. So, have you ever heard of phrenology? Phrenology was very popular for about 10 to 15 years in the early 1900s, and it's typically viewed as the study of the skull. So phrenology believed that your skull, with all its different grooves and bumps and areas, will determine a lot about your own personality. So if you reach up and you touch your skull right now, you're going to feel that there are certain bumps in certain areas, you're going to feel that there's a groove in certain areas, and it might be kind of a little larger in some other parts, and all of that is a bit unique to you as an individual. So this concept of phrenology, this study of bumps and grooves to determine your behaviors, was kind of viewed as fact. However, it was quickly disproven by the scientific community once they started realizing that it was pseudoscience, and instead it was adopted that not your skull is identifying who you are as an individual, but it's your brain. So breaking your brain into particular categories will determine who you are as an individual, and oftentimes a lot about your own personality. So why do we study the brain? When we look at this meaty, pink, gooey stuff up there, and we're trying to figure out how it relates towards who we are as individuals, our consciousness, looking into how it controls our behavior, it's a very complex process. But one of the biggest reasons why we study the brain is to understand the relationship between the brain and the mind. The mind is what the brain does. And when you think about your mind and you try to define what a mind is, it can be very abstract of a concept because your mind is really you. Your mind is how you think, how you act, how you like things, and how you dislike things. Some people will call it your personality or maybe even your spirit. But your mind is going to be a byproduct of your brain and how your brain functions. So, in understanding why we study the brain, we are trying to understand its relationship with what makes you you, essentially, the mind. Now, your brain broken into different categories of structures is really going to help us identify what part of your brain develops and what part of your brain interacts with certain thoughts and experiences. So, if you were to cut open my head and poke me on different parts of my brain, like in my motor cortex, you might make my right arm start to flop, to twitch. If you poked my temporal lobe, you would start to remember, or I would start to remember maybe a very important experience in my life, like my first kiss. And if you if you punch my occipital lobe, the back of my brain, I might black out. It's actually one of the reasons that in the movies, if someone gets hit over the head, at the back of the head, they black out right away. It's because the occipital lobe controls a lot of what we see. And so different parts of your brain are going to stimulate different parts of your movement, emotions, and your personality. And it really helps on breaking it down into subcategories. Now, when you think of the brain, try and envision it kind of like layers upon layers. So, kind of like an onion that has a central core layer. So, the inner core of this brain, referred oftentimes as the old brain, is some of the oldest structures that control the basic functions of everyday life. So, you've got your brainstem. This is what extends into your body and up into your brain. And your brainstem is important for actions such as breathing and heartbeats. Also, by the way, I do have a printed handout of this on Canvas that includes these categories. So if you'd like to, you can print that out and you can go ahead and fill in the blanks and include that in your study materials. When the brainstem connects with the brain, it develops into the medulla. This second layer controls a lot of heartbeat and breathing as well, and often connects the brainstem towards some of these biological behaviors related towards cognition. So it might connect your heartbeat and breathing towards how you're feeling at a particular moment. Next, you have these two structures that come off of the medulla called the pons. The pons help control your movement. So they will help very basic movements, such as moving your arms or moving your legs. The very top of the older brain is called the thalamus. And the thalamus acts like a relay station. It relays information from higher functioning structures of the brain down towards lower functioning structures or older structures. And it connects a lot of the brain's areas towards each other. Kind of like interneurons connect a lot of information from one neuron to the next. The thalamus relays information from one area of the brain to the other area, kind of acting like a train station. Inside the middle, connected towards the brainstem and the thalamus, is the reticular formation. The reticular formation is important for a lot of basic functioning like pain perception, sleeping, and walking. And then last, you have the cerebellum. The cerebellum, often referred to as the little brain because it has a lot of the same structures. It has a very similar structure and look that the large brain does. It controls a lot of coordinated nonverbal memory. So if you need to remember how to ride a bike or dribble a ball, these are going to be actions that require a little more finesse, and the cerebellum is going to use that muscle memory, and it's going to condense it in this area. So one of the reasons that this is referred to as the old brain is because from an evolutionary standpoint, most animals that are vertebrates have these structures located in their brains. And so reptiles, lizards, some of the oldest animals that we have on the planet have these old brain structures. And they use that in order to adapt towards their environment. Here, let's watch this.
Now, is there anyone here that can tell me why most alligators are abnormally aggressive?
I know the answer to this question. Raise your hand.
Anybody? Anyone? Yes or you, sir?
Mama says that alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth but no toothbrush.
Your mama said alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth and no toothbrush. Wow. Anybody else? Yes or you, sir?
Alligators are aggressive because of an enlarged medulla oblongata. It's the sector of the brain which controls aggressive behavior.
That is correct. The medulla oblongata.
But Mama
The
said
medulla oblongata is where anger, jealousy, and aggression come from. Now, is there anybody here who can tell me where happiness comes from? Anyone? All right. Let's hear what Mama has to say on the subject.
Mama say that happiness is from magic rays of sunshine that come down when you're feeling blue.
Well, folks, Mama's wrong again.
No, Colonel Sanders, you're wrong. Mama's right.
Mama's right. Mama's right. Something wrong with his medulla oblongata. It's okay to fight back. Coach Klein said I could.
Mr. Coach Klein said I could. It's fine.
Okay, I know we're not in class anymore, but I'm going to stress the point that even if a professor makes you upset, please do not tackle them. It's just not a great way to end the day. Okay, so we've got right here a blown up structure of this older brain. And as they were talking about in this clip, they were discussing structures of it that relate towards very basic functions. So instead of, if we're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, instead of humans or mammals developing a whole new brain, they've merely built on layers upon it. And in order to do that, they've developed higher functioning based upon those layers. However, a lot of their key features, those basic reptilian instincts, still exist inside of these structures. Now, the thalamus, aside from just being a relay point, also has a very interesting point to it. It acts as a crossover point, meaning that it crosses over the nerves from one side of the body to the opposite side of the brain. So the left side of your body is actually controlled and interpreted by the right side of your brain, while the right side of your body is controlled and interpreted by the left side of your brain. And this crossover point is due towards the thalamus, this relay station. Now, there's a lot of theories as to why this actually is set up this way. But one of the major ones is if there's any damage towards the brain, or any damage towards an area of the body, this crossover point will allow an easier ability for the brain to heal and to control the opposite side. Later on, we'll talk a little bit about how that looks in a real life situation, but this crossover point is important for understanding the complexity of how the thalamus interacts with communicating information throughout the brain. Okay, so we have that old brain category right here, these basic structures. The second layer built on top of it is called the limbic system. And the limbic system is really important for some cognitions such as memories and emotions. So we've got the amygdala right here, this P-shaped structure that's located near the thalamus. And the amygdala is important for emotions that are linked towards memories, so fears and pleasures. So whenever you watch scary movies and you're starting to be afraid, or maybe afterwards you want to keep the light on because those clowns might be coming through the door, that's really the amygdala at work. Over here, we've got, let me pull this up too. So over here, this structure right here, I talked about it previously. This is called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland. If you remember from the endocrine system, the pituitary gland is important for releasing hormones. And it's also important for waking up other glands so that they can release their own individual hormones. It's the master gland. So the pituitary gland communicates with the hypothalamus because the hypothalamus is important for keeping the body steady. It regulates the internal complexities of the body, such as hunger and body temperature and sleep. So it communicates with the gland when it needs to interact with the body, when it needs to wake up other glands and do things. Then we have this snail-like structure right here. And this structure right here is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is important for learning and memory. It is a thing that condenses short-term memories into long-term memory storage. So if you need to remember things maybe for the upcoming exam, and you create a study guide and you start studying it, the hippocampus is important for turning that information into a long-lasting memory that you can use for when the test actually comes. Finally, we have the top layer of the brain. And when you look at a diagram of the brain, you're usually going to see it broken into these 4 sections. This right here is called the cortex, the top layer of the brain. And the cortex, broken into these 4 sections, control a wide variety of complex feelings and behaviors. The first frontal lobe is called the frontal lobe, and this area is important for developing really who you are as an individual. So it's going to be things like personality, it's going to be your thinking and how you feel and act in a particular way. It'll be important for planning, So if you make plans for something in the future, it's important for thinking through problems and problem solving. It's also important for speaking and writing. Next, right behind it, we have the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is important for determining size, shape, color, and sense of touch and pain and temperature. So if you are trying to determine by looking at something how far away it is, what color it is, how it moves, the parietal lobe will decide a lot of those complex ideas associated with vision. The temporal lobe is important for your speech, your memory, understanding, and organization. Now, if you see here, I've got speaking up here, and then I've got speech down here. The distinction between this is speaking is your ability to speak, moving those vocal muscles and moving your tongue so that you can make complex sounds, while speech is really an organization of how we speak. Organizing sentences, understanding grammar and syntax in order to form complex sentences. And the final lobe in the very back is called the occipital lobe. Its main concern is vision. I always thought it was ironic that it's located at the very back of your head when your eyes are at the very front. However, this right here, vision, is really specific towards taking in what you are seeing. Well, it doesn't necessarily organize that information. It sends that information to other areas to be organized. It still receives, kind of like a camera taking a picture, a snapshot of what you are seeing at that very moment. Now, the structures that we were talking about, these 4 lobes, can also be broken into subcategories. So we've got the frontal lobe that can be broken into a particular area. This particular area is called the motor cortex. And the motor cortex is important for voluntary movements. It's what tells you to do a particular action, like pick up that cup, drink that coffee, pet that dog. These are all actions that are voluntary movements that you choose to do. You send information from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system to certain muscle groups to move your body. Right next to it, located in the parietal lobe, is the somatosensory cortex, or just the sensory cortex. Sensory cortex is used for processing touch and body movements. So if you move a particular way, you also have to determine why you're moving and how that movement is successful or isn't successful so you can adapt towards it. This will tell you that, yeah, I pet that dog and that dog is fluffy. So that'll be the second distinction of what you're actually looking at. Okay, so this will be activity number 2. So on Canvas, I have posted a worksheet, and this worksheet is going to be looking at all these different structures of the brain and relating it towards the actions of this character. So this is Kramer from Seinfeld. And Kramer, if you've ever seen Seinfeld, he's very slapstick. He constantly, runs into things and falls over, and there's a lot of like physical comedy in his movements. And so he's always hitting his head, and it interacts with him in one particular way or another. So look at the examples, and I want you to choose, based upon the structures that we've talked about, which one of the structures of the brain is probably most affected by his interaction or his accident. Okay, so this is going to be it for video 1. You'll also see video 2 published at the same time. So after you're done with this, make sure you go into video 2.